Hello everyone and welcome back to our lecture series on literary criticism theories particularly. By the way, we are meeting in this lecture series for like for last few months particularly, where we have been discussing about the significance of literary critical theories and literary critics prominently, who have played a great amount of role, by the way. And while talking about those very prominent figures, otherwise, we have been discussing about so many periods particularly, and I would say we are at the conclusion of this very particular topic. Exactly, that the various literary critical theories and criticism that got you know greatly popularized otherwise. Right? So we are preparing keeping the net and set examination into our vision, by the way, and the topic we have been discussing so far is the literary criticism and the theories that have got greatly published in this very particular period, right? So various theories and literary criticism that got greatly popularized. By the way, for your information, we have talked about the uh, Old English period so far, or we can say the classical work that got produced, right? Yes. Uh, then we have talked about some Elizabethan period, or which can be considered again as the kind of like a traditionally considered period in case of understanding the history of English literature otherwise. Which can be considered as a Renaissance criticism otherwise, right? In which so we have talked about Renaissance criticism and prominent figures in Renaissance criticism. Exactly. Then we have talked about the emergence of neoclassical ideas, neoclassical period of criticism, right? Within which we have got Puritan period, neoclassical period. Prior to that, we have got other few periods, particularly, right? After neoclassical period, we have talked about the Romantic period and how literature and literary criticism got greatly published, right? Then we talked about Victorian period, right? And today, or in this lecture series, we are going to talk about the modern period, right? Which plays a kind of a significant role. Meanwhile, while preparing for this, guys, let's not forget we also have done some question and answer sessions too, particularly highlighting various otherwise those MCQs, right? And the various explanations we had on those MCQs particularly. Now, I'm sorry. So we have got those many things we have done already, right? So, talking about the significance of those particular things, it is much more important to understand those various periods who play a kind of a great amount of role in case of understanding the literary criticism and those various theories that have got published, right? And as we are solving various question answers, we also have come across this very important part that how the questions are supposed to be answered and how their phrasing matters the most and understanding of them. Now, recapitulating what we have discussed in the previous lecture is of a great significance. Otherwise, people, I would say, because in the previous lecture series we have greatly discussed about few of the other prominent factors, right? As I said, particularly we have talked about the Victorian period in the previous lecture, and also we have been through question bank. Otherwise, if you remember, right? So let us just revise what we have been discussed so far, because in a way, in the every lecture from last few lectures, I have been telling you very significantly that when we try to understand particularly when we have been through all those periods, exactly we have tried to understand initial stage, as we are quite much more about understanding of what is mean literary criticism and how this literary criticism particularly helps in case of understanding various factors that are quite important otherwise, right? So apart from that, in the very first lecture, or in the from last 1 or 2 weeks, I have been telling you very sincerely about this fact that when we try to when we are in the phase of understanding the new period of literary criticism, we have to have this very idea that exactly the notions, the ideas of previous period are some or the other way peeping, or they have in a way laid foundations to the emergence or the bringing of new thought or ideology which introduced in a particular period, right? So those ideas that got considered, let's say, now, when we talk about the Renaissance period, exactly somehow the classical touch or the Old English period had been over there, and the various those various classical works were some or the other way guiding path, was like a guiding path for the Renaissance period. Exactly, though it is a revival, rebirth, and so we find that the excess of something in that particular period lays a foundation to the new thoughts. Exactly, so the excess of neoclassical period can be seen in Romantic period, exactly, and the unlimited emancipation and liberal unlimited emancipation and freedom in a way, or the consideration of society, we can see the social reformation or the social concerns greatly aroused in Victorian period, and so we have got the prominent figures in Victorian period who have come up with their social concerns particularly. Now when we try to understand criticism literally taking shape, exactly. So it starts from the particularly Dr. Samuel Johnson, exactly. And when it comes to talk about Romantic period, we have got S.T. Coleridge with us, to whom we can say, or about whom it is said that somewhere S.T. Coleridge is the one who looked at criticism in a philosophical angle, particularly, right? So when we read his literary biographia, exactly Biographia Literaria, we realize that the kind of philosophical notions, the kind of ideas that he has talked about criticism, the art that is poetry, exactly, and defining the significance of poetry, illustrating the various dimensions of imagination and fancy, we find him giving up with much of philosophical angle particularly. So it is much more of importance, I would say, here to understand the role of that contemporary, right? So now, when we talked about Victorian period particularly, while talking about Victorian period, we have tried to understand how the Victorian period, the criticism in Victorian period got shaped. What were the various factors that influenced the shaping of critical ideas and thoughts in Victorian period? Then we talked about major critics, the prominent figures, exactly, and then we also have been through the prominent characteristics of that particular period, right? How Victorian period got published. Now, when we talk about, we have to take the link of all those various periods, right? And all these periods that I have written over here on this blackboard, they have got their much more of significance. Now, when you talk about Old English period particularly, criticism has not got that developed the way we see the criticism has got developed particularly. Somewhere the critics themselves were trying to find out certain set of rules, exactly. The actual definition or the illustrative definition of criticism we have right now in front of us, or when we deal with criticism, the definition that we understand was not the same thing when we try to understand critical theories. So there are no theories or treatises as such, or essays as such, written in Old English period or even in Renaissance period particularly, when we try to understand the Renaissance criticism particularly. When we go to the neoclassical period, we have got people around like Alexander Pope, then we have got people around like John Dryden, then we have got people around like Sir Philip Sidney, then we have got people around like Samuel Johnson, exactly. So those are the people in a way from whom, or we can say in that period somewhere, the structure of criticism got some or the other way formulated, exactly. So the critical ideas that got introduced to the people in the contemporary period were in a structurized way, exactly. The systematic arrangement of those ideas and the critical assessment of the text could be seen done in this very particular period. So these periods, and so as I said, the formulation of those various periods matters the most, because according, based on those various periods only, we realize that the critical ideas and the literature that got produced in the period had got its importance particularly, exactly. So understanding the basic function of criticism at the first, and then criticizing several things that were around their evaluation, assessment, judgment, and various interpretations could be seen, and they were definitely influenced by the then social conditions and political conditions, and definitely the civilizations. Now, when we talk about the various genres of drama or various genres of literature, also let's say drama, poetry, their fame and their importance and their popularity changes into various periods as they get changed in various periods, particularly according to the notions of the society. Likewise, it is the same with criticism too, particularly that various critical identities and ideas gets getting changed in those various periods or those various time spans, particularly can be noted down. And thus, I would say it is of a much more importance to understand the role of criticism, particularly. Now, when we shift from our ideas to the neoclassical, where there was a lot of there was a lot of importance to reference of the classicals, where there was a lot of importance to bringing back the classical ideas, reading more of classical literature so that ideas can be generally related, exactly, where there was a greater value to the reason, exactly, in a way, otherwise, exactly. So nature was there, form was there, exactly, the natural form, exactly, the art that got higher amount of popularity, the function of criticism was discussed, otherwise. Now, when you talk about the Renaissance period or Old English period, the function of criticism was not discussed, where we find the role of a critic and the function of criticism can be discussed by Alexander Pope. So, the evolution of critical theories and criticism can be greatly observed in the time span. In the course of time, it's always in or the other way, uh, its updated version can be seen in every period, and that's the specialty of literary criticism, particularly, right? And how when we try to say that, as I said, the formalization of essays or treatises, or in a way the structured written format, or in a way, considering separately understanding literature, separate way notion can be seen, beginning from neoclassical period. And again, when we try to understand the various romantic ideas, right? We realize that its importance had got greatly increased otherwise, right? So it is of much more importance to understand the role of literary criticism, particularly in case of understanding, when it comes to understand, when it comes to deal with the literature of that contemporary period and how it got influenced, right? And so we find that it was the same with romantic period, Victorian period, and also now the modern period of literature that we are going to understand, exactly. And so it is a thing to be observed always when it comes to study literature and the critical theories that got introduced, particularly. Exactly, those terminologies allow us to comprehend the ideas that were put forth by then the contemporary critics. Now, let us take an example of some critics from Victorian era. Exactly. So, era, the criticism of Victorian era amalgamates the social concern, defining critic not just only an individual identity of evaluating, or not just as a text analyst, but it is much of a social, in a way, it has got blessed with some social responsibilities too. And like he is like a prophet, he is like an educator, he is like a torch bearer for the society, where he highlights the moralistic approach, and accordingly, literature, if it is produced with that kind of point of view. So this kind of notion also can be seen with understanding the critical theories and their roles, exactly, and accordingly the function of criticism changing in various course of time. As I said, the point that I discussed some minutes ago or some minutes before is that the function of criticism can be seen very much well explained in the later period of literary criticism, right? No, it is not the same we can see in Augustan period or Anglo-Saxon period or Old English period or Renaissance period, likewise. But when you just move ahead with neoclassical thoughts, romantic thoughts, exactly, now the Victorian thoughts, exactly, so we find that those ideas getting shaped, exactly, and somewhere, exactly, the various social changes, globalization, amalgamation of cultural thoughts, cultures, and many other things in a way otherwise have influenced the formulation of critical base in those various periods, exactly. And thus it is much more important to understand those various backgrounds when it comes to talk about the criticism in that particular period. So when I say I'm talking about the modern criticism of literary, English literature particularly, I need to know what were the various angles that were socially taking place. Exactly, the scientific advancement, the technological expansion, exactly, and lot many things are there. So the trade, the culture, the society, exactly, the styles of celebration, all those things in or the other way. As literature is nothing but the representation of life, we realize that this or this some or the other way makes kind of a greater impact, right? And so, as I stated previously, that in this period, no, in this lecture, we are going to prominently talk about the modern period of literary criticism. Let's go and start discussing about the modern period. Exactly. Now, when we try to understand the modern period, exactly, it is somehow the other way. It is the end of somehow the 19th century, and we can see it clearly relying and ruling in a way the first half of, yes, the first half of 20th century, right? Uh, so maybe it covers somehow from 1894 or let's say 90 to somewhere in I'm sorry, uh, from 19 to let's say 1960 somewhere, exactly. So we have got this remarking period. So let's go and try to understand what is the feature of modern period of English literature particularly, and the criticism how it got shaped otherwise, right? Now, the term modern period of English literature, it generally refers to the late 19th century to the mid 20th century. As I said, the 19th century and the beginning of 20th century can be referred, which roughly spans between 1890 to 1960, the gap of around 70 years. And this was a time of rapid social, scientific, and intellectual change. Exactly, the old certainties of religion, morality, and tradition began to collapse under the pressure of industrialization, world wars, and new philosophical ideas. Exactly. Now, we can see, as the paragraph states us about the background of the beginning of modern period in English literature, which covers from somewhere 1890 to 1960, the span of around 6 to 7 decades particularly. Exactly. Now, these 6 to 7 decades are much more important at the canvas of world. Exactly, at a world canvas. Exactly. Why? Because various political and social and definitely the various disciplines of knowledge and their advancement in case of updation of knowledge can be seen can be seen stretching their horizons or increasing their horizons widely, right? So the world war was again an impactful factor that was that cannot be skipped that cannot be skipped when it comes to understand the shaping of literary criticism particularly, right? So when we try to understand this modern period, various scientific innovations, the extremely expanding industrialization, globalization, the world coming closer, exactly. So exchange of ideas, exchange of cultural things, celebration style, living style, so many things were there that were getting exchanged, and definitely they were original. They were mixing up with the originals, exactly, and so the originals too, while inheriting them from their ancestors, would be seen getting up with their updated versions, exactly. And so this also I'm sorry, somehow shaped the style of literature otherwise, exactly. And so we have got expression for that the old certainties, exactly, the firm thoughts about religion, morality, and the tradition, they began to collapse under the pressures of industrialization, world wars, and the new philosophical ideas, exactly. So till Victorian period, when we try to understand the literature that got produced in English, in English literature particularly, some or the other way, I don't know if I'm going, if I'm making this statement in the right sense or what, but I would say that, in my opinion, otherwise, that the world, no, the English literature was confined to the European countries only, or few of the European figures only, right? Till the end of, we can say, Romantic period particularly, right? Yet now some American writers, or some, we can say, otherwise the English writers were there, British writers were there, or we can say European writers were there who were greatly contributing, and so the critics were there. But when we talk about this very period, the end of 19th century and the first half of 20th century, which is completely a modern period where world had come close, and the industrialization, business transactions on a world level, at international level, could be seen, and thus travel was increased, and accordingly cultural, cultural thoughts, ideas, notions were shared, associated, they were found assimilating, somewhere they were completely a contradictory part otherwise. So various things were there that were taking place when we try to understand, that were taking place, and thus those factors definitely, in a way, affected the society. Now, as the society did not accept those concerns that were the part of major understanding, those were, no, the factors that were the major concerns of the previous periods, particularly when we talk about morality, when we talk about religion, when we talk about spirituality, those were the several factors that were greatly discussed otherwise by the critics and the then literary men in the previous periods compared to modern period, right? So their adjustment, their understanding can be seen in the previous period, but due to the industrialization, world war, and the beginning of new philosophical dimensions, somewhere made a pressure point for those ideas, and those ideas, the ideas like those certainties about religion, the certainties about religion, thought, or otherwise morality and tradition, can be seen collapsing otherwise, right? So in a way, this remains kind of like a significant factor to take into consideration, right? So हा मुद्दा अतिशय महत्त्वाचा आहे की जो आपण इथे लक्षात ठेवला पाहिजे. When we talk about the background of modern period, exactly when we are trying to understand how, what was the status exactly of a society when we talk about the modern period of literary criticism particularly. Now when we talk about the further part, we have is that the late Victorian moral confidence was replaced by an age of anxiety. Exactly, world war was going to take place. There are several factors, people, we are going to discuss otherwise, right? uh, the psychological dimensions was the psychological thought process, exactly, liberalism was there, emancipation was there, feminism was there, so many, the new criticism got introduced, and then there were Russian thinkers, French thinkers, then there were African literature, all sort of things. As the world had come close, exactly, the feeling, the expressions had got a lot of importance otherwise, right? And so everybody expressed what they felt, and exactly, as world war was there, unemployment was there, and exactly somewhere the feeling of we are lost, or we are clutched into the traps of this society, or the traps of modernity could be seen over there, and due to which, exactly, so the law the due to which various psychological factors that were greatly discussed, and the advancement in those factors could be noticed, exactly. So when we try to understand the Victorian age, that was completely, now when in the previous lecture we discussed about Victorian period particularly, people, we realized that Victorian period had given much of importance to the social concerns, morality, exactly. And so the second phase of this Victorian period can be seen greatly dwelling into, dwelling into the aesthetics movements, aestheticism, arts for art's sake. So those were the thoughts which would be seen. But when you talk about modern period particularly, exactly, the moral confidence that was there in Victorian period, it can be seen replaced by an age of anxiety. Exactly, writers and thinkers which were there in the modern period, they began to question the inherited beliefs about art, meaning, and truth particularly. And so we find that, exactly, this age of anxiety was sure, but this period, questioning became a significant part actually, right? So the practicality, the scientific advancement, and the process of testing the truth in various dimensions before accepting it as a truth, exactly, or anything as a fact, and its various analytical approaches could be seen developed with not just only scientific notions but some art background too. And so we find that the people beginning to question about the acceptance of something that is inherited into the beliefs thoughts or ideas or meanings particularly. And this questioning otherwise produced the modernism. Exactly, it is a movement that sought new forms of experiences and new ways of understanding human experience. Exactly. Now, as I stated, we can easily understand when we talk about modern period people particularly, that in this period the advancement of technology, the advancement of philosophical dimensions, exactly, advancement in all sort of fields or arenas can be noticed quite greatly, and thus we can see these advancements making its a rapid impact on so many factors, especially the disciplines, various disciplines of knowledge which were existing. And so that's that's where we can see this modernity that gets conceived. Exactly. So the questioning, exactly, the inherited facts, meanings, truths, beliefs which were there, they were getting questioned. Exactly. जे पहिल्या पिढीकडून पुढच्या पिढीकडे थॉट्स मध्ये किंवा वारसा म्हणून जे येतं ना, की हे विचार असे असतात, ह्या सणांचं सेलिब्रेशन असं आहे, लाईक ह्या ज्या गोष्टी असतात ना, किंवा पोएट्री अशा फॉर्मने अंडरस्टँड करायची असते. उदाहरणार्थ पोएट्रीची डेफिनेशन रोमॅन्टिक पिरियडमध्ये वेगळी दिसते, विक्टोरियन पिरियडमध्ये वेगळी दिसते, अरिस्टॉटलची वेगळी दिसते. इट इज देअर परसेप्शन. एक्झॅक्टली. सम पीपल फॉलोड देम. In the next period, they were questioned that why it is to be like that. Exactly, Wordsworth feels that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, re-originated in tranquility. I do not find it so. A kind of question could be there, and these are, this technique somewhere we can see. Otherwise, conceived the thoughts, exactly, or laid a foundation to the modern thoughts that got increased. Exactly, and so the dimension of understanding the human experience could be seen getting completely changed. Exactly. So in literary criticism, what changes were taking place? Let's see them. This period marks a kind of a major transformation, people, compared to the when we talk about other periods, विक्टोरियन पिरियड मध्ये 2 ते 3 डिकेड्स एक थॉट चालतो का, जेव्हा थॉमस कार्लाइल, जॉन रस्किन, अर्नॉल्ड यासारख्या क्लासिकल मॉरलिस्ट लोकांकडे आपण बघतो ना, right, we realize that their thoughts have got settled for at least 2 to 3 decades. Then we have got other thinkers like Walter Pater, then we have got somebody like John Stuart Mill, then we have got the proponents and follower of Walter Scott or Oscar Wilde over there, who also continues with the tradition or the thought process that was discussed by Walter Scott for sure. So हे कुठेतरी 4 ते 5 डिकेड चालतं, पण इथे या 5 ते 6 डिकेड्स मध्ये, दशकांमध्ये रॅपिड थॉट प्रोसेस चेंज होताना दिसते. Exactly, and thus it is, in a way considered as the age or the period of major transformations. Exactly, before modernism, the criticism often or for many a times focused on moral instructions or on the author's personality, particularly, right? So this thought was somewhere there. When we talk about Victorian period also, we realize that Victorian period चं अजून एक काय महत्व आहे. Victorian period मध्ये सगळ्यात prominently काय दिसून येत होतं Victorian period मध्ये, in a way we notice otherwise that this period makes a kind of a great contribution otherwise, where we are there to understand, Victorian period मध्ये काय दिसतं तर लिटरेचर हे फक्त काय म्हणायचं त्याला, इट इज नॉट जस्ट अ टेक्स्ट ऑफ अनालिसिस अदरवाइज, राईट, समथिंग दॅट शुड बी अनालाइज. म्हणजे क्रिटिक्सचे फंक्शन सांगताना सुद्धा, फंक्शन्स ऑफ क्रिटिसिझममध्ये क्रिटिकने हे फक्त टेक्स्ट अनालिसिस करणं एवढंच काम नसून समाजाला शिकवणं किंवा लिटरेचरकडे बघत असताना तिथल्या क्रिटिक्सनी दे हॅव ग्रेटली स्टेटेड दॅट द लिटरेचर हॅज नॉट ओनली फंक्शन टू डिलाइट, it has a function to teach morals, instruct the society, come up with better systems that could be adapted, implemented and used in a successful way. अशा बऱ्याचशा गोष्टी त्या काळातल्या लिटरेचरमध्ये दिसतात. पण एक्झॅक्टली, सो वी हॅव गॉट रोमॅन्टिक क्रिटिसिझम, व्हॅल्यूड imagination and inspiration, and the Victorian critics like Matthew Arnold, who saw literature as a moral guide. But with the advent of the modern period, critics began to treat literature as a self-contained, autonomous field of study and worthy of scientific and theoretical examination. Exactly, and thus in the modern period, this new thought can be seen, getting conceived very easily or in a smooth way otherwise. Okay, for sure it was not after a great amount of struggle, for sure it was not without any great amount of struggle, but yet, so हा अँगल आहे की जो कम्प्लिटली ट्रान्सफॉर्म करतो. म्हणजे एकीकडे विक्टोरियन एरा आहे, डेफिनेटली मॅथ्यू आर्नॉल्ड सारखे लोक आहेत, ऑस्कर वाईल्ड सारखे लोक आहेत, वॉल्टर पॅटर सारखे लोक आहेत की ज्यांच्या रेबेलियन थॉटनी ॲक्सेप्टन्स ऑफ मॉडर्निटी आणि क्वेश्चनिंग दिसतं की जे मॉडर्निझमचं किंवा मॉडर्न थॉटचं सगळ्यात मोठं बेसिक कॅरेक्टरिस्टिक्स आहे, राईट. अँड सो वी कॅन सी literature considered or the criticism treated literature as a self-contained or autonomous field of study which was worthy of scientific and theoretical examination. And this could be seen with this particularly understanding the role of modern period particularly, right, or the role of criticism in modern period people, right. So it is of much more important to understand that. Further, let us try to understand the background, exactly the intellectual climate of modernity, particularly, right. Uh, so it is much more important to understand the uh, modern literary criticism, and prior to that, it is much more important to have a look at the broader, the broader industrial context they had. So the very first point we have is the impact of science and technology. Now, when we try to understand the advancement of scientific things and scientific notions, beliefs, explanations, evaluations, especially in the 19th century, the scientific thinking can be seen at the peak. Exactly. So we have got initially in the Victorian period, we also have seen the Darwin's theory of origin of species, which had shaken the traditional views of man's place in the universe, right. And as it was considered superior, where Darwin's study and his various discoveries made the world, left the world into a great thought otherwise, right. खूप त्या काळी तहलका म्हणजे काय म्हणायचं त्याला, खूप खूप मोठा एकदम धक्का होता सगळ्यांसाठी तो, कारण त्यावेळेस माणूस, माणसाची स्पिरिच्युअल आयडेंटिटी, माणसाचं महत्व, superior to all the other species, so many things were there, exactly. And rather it was considered as a divine appearance, right. But somewhere this treatise brought kind of a new dimension to this society, and somewhere it also in a way laid foundations for the upcoming modern thoughts, right. And so the criticism began to apply the same. So scientific encouraged objectivity, analysis, and skepticism, right. You must question, you must analyze, you must examine, assess, and accordingly interpret and discuss or explain. What the kind of a method has to be followed was discussed by the scientific notions, and somewhere those notions got greatly consumed when we talk about the literature in modern period very particularly, right. So we can see the critics that they were beginning to apply the same rigorous, exactly, and methodological approach to the literature that scientists apply to nature particularly. So as I said, exactly, ज्याप्रमाणे सायंटिस्ट लोक किंवा सायन्स बॅकग्राऊंड लोक अनालिटिकल माइंडनी सायंटिफिक गोष्टींकडे, त्यांच्या डिस्कवरीजकडे बघायचे, तो जो एक थॉट लाईन होती ना, किंवा ती जी एक स्टडी लाईन होती, किंवा एक तो जो अप्रोच होता, तो अप्रोच लिटररी क्रिटिक्सने त्या काळात म्हणजे मॉडर्न पिरियडमध्ये प्रोड्यूस होत गेलेल्या लिटरेचरकडे, त्याच्यामध्ये एक्सप्रेस केलेल्या आयडियाजकडे, थीम्सकडे बघताना डेव्हलप केलेला दिसतो. हे त्यामागचं सगळ्यात मोठं वैशिष्ट्य आहे, राईट. जसं सायंटिफिक ॲटिट्यूडनी एखाद्या सायन्स एक्सपेरिमेंटकडे बघतात, एक्झॅक्टली तशाच काइंड ऑफ थॉट प्रोसेसने किंवा तशाच आयडिओलॉजीजने किंवा तशाच एका सिस्टमाइज वेनी लिटररी टेक्स्टकडे बघण्याचा, लिटररी टेक्स्टला असेस करण्याचा, इव्हॅल्युएट करण्याचा कुठेतरी एक पॉईंट इथे डेव्हलप झालेला दिसतो. अँड इट इज मच मोर ऑफ अ इम्पॉर्टन्स टू बी टेकन इन टू consideration. Exactly, the decline of religion and certainty. Exactly, after the two world wars, which are very important to be taken into consideration, the traditional faith and moral order can be seen, quite inadequate to explain the chaos of modern life. As the wars were not expected, the displacement that took place after war, and particularly war effects, there was no explanation for those things particularly, exactly. So the moral guides which were there, the religious guides which were there, you can see they could be seen quite inadequate or insufficient to explain the result or reason or impact of this modern chaos. हा chaos कशामुळे आहे, का आहे, यातून बाहेर कसं पडायचं आणि याच्यामध्ये रिलिजनकडे काय उत्तर आहे, एक्झॅक्टली स्पिरिच्युअलिटीकडे काय उत्तर आहे, एक्झॅक्टली ट्रॅडिशनकडे काय उत्तर आहे. सो द फेथ अँड मॉरल ऑर्डर एक्झॅक्टली अबाउट द religion or can be seen now. So literature reflected into fragmentation, alienation, and disillusionment, and the critics sought new tools to make sense of this complexity. Exactly. जसं आपण म्हणतो की लिटरेचर हे काय आहे तर समाजाचं प्रतिबिंब आहे. इट इज अ रिफ्लेक्शन ऑफ सोसायटी. What you notice in society has to be there in the text, or we can see the same descriptions. Exactly, though the creative imagination of an author or the poet can be easily noticed. Exactly, and that is the skillful part of that literary piece, otherwise, for sure, which cannot be avoided now in an assessment of that particular literary piece, for sure. But at the same time, when we talk about the reflection of society, critics can be seen referring to those factors very effectively. Otherwise, when they were talking about the decline of religion and certainty, particularly. So, the literature that was there, it got reflected into fragmentation, alienation. Exactly, सगळ्यातनं बाहेर पडायचं. Exactly. ज्या लोकांनी अक्षरशः समोरासमोर डेथ बघितली होती त्यांच्याकडे दुसरा काय थांबणार आहे आणि तशा प्रकारचं जीवन जगणार आहे. एक्झॅक्टली वॉर अफेक्टेड एरियाजमध्ये लोकांमध्ये ते एक एलिनेशन आलं. डिसइल्युजनमेंट मध्ये एक्झॅक्टली illusionary part, disillusionment, exactly. And so we can see critics seeking new tools to make sense of these complexities, exactly. So how these factors, fragmentation, alienation, and disillusionment, that was reflected through then contemporary literature of modern period, right? So modern period मध्ये जे लिटरेचर होतं ना, त्या लिटरेचरमध्ये ज्या काही गोष्टी प्रॉमिनंटली डिस्कस केल्या गेल्या होत्या ना, त्याचा कुठेतरी क्रिटिक लोकांनी आपल्या स्टाईलने मांडण्यासाठी काय केलं तर नवीन टूल्स तयार करण्याचा प्रयत्न केला. एक्झॅक्टली दॅट वुड मेक द सेन्स ऑफ दिस कॉम्प्लेक्सिटीज. एक्झॅक्टली दोज कॉम्प्लेक्सिटीज, दिस कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी particularly of sorry, explaining the literature of modern period is of a much more importance, right? Now we can see the further important part that is to be taken into consideration when we talk about the background of modernism, influence of philosophy and psychology. Exactly, there were prominent figures like Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, who, with their great thought, influenced the modern thinking style. Particularly, Nietzsche's attack on traditional morality in a way introduced the idea of relativism, that is, truth is not absolute but constructed, right? And this thought is of a much more important that was put forth over here. Exactly. So, his traditional morality introduced the idea of relativism, where it was said that truth is not absolute but constructed. Exactly. In a way, we can say formulated. You formulate the truth, you construct it. Exactly. And this construction is based on purely nothing but, in a way, the assessment, or we can say the analysis, otherwise, or in a way, examine. So you examine it, you analyze it, you assess it, and accordingly you go on making your opinion. And that kind of philosophical notion can be put forth, can be seen, put forth over here by Nietzsche, right? And so we can see his attack on traditional morality. So initially we have seen the inheritance of thoughts, beliefs, meanings, which were questioned. हे असंच का, याला आत्ता असंच का ऍक्सेप्ट करायचं, त्या काळी ते तसं होतं, म्हणजे आता ऍप्लिकेबल आहे का. एक्झॅक्टली हा जो अनालिटिकल थॉट आला ना, एक्झॅक्टली हा अनालिटिकल थॉट कुठेतरी या सगळ्या गोष्टींना क्वेश्चन करायला लागला. आणि त्यांनी फक्त त्याच गोष्टी नाही, खटकणाऱ्या गोष्टीच नाहीत, तर त्या सगळ्या गोष्टींना क्वेश्चन करण्याची सुरुवात कुठेतरी या मॉडर्न थॉटमध्ये झालेली असते. मॉडर्न क्रिटिक्स हे मोर ऑफ, जसं म्हणलं की सायंटिफिक ॲडव्हान्समेंट, the impact of science was such a great that the literary critics too applied the same method for their criticism, or can be seen seeking those tools only normally which were of a scientific identification, scientific notions, right? So we have got Freud, exactly, Dr. Sigmund Freud, and what he does, he explores the unconscious mind influencing psychoanalytic approaches, exactly, and this is of great importance that oh, somebody for the first time had come forward that would talk about mind, the angles of mind, exactly the segments of mind, exactly the consciousness, unconsciousness, superconsciousness, id, idam, exactly, and the mind and the superconscious mind or unconscious mind, subconscious mind, exactly the thoughts, the behavior patterns, the impact of behavior patterns on thoughts, thoughts impacting the behavior patterns, thoughts governing the behavioral pattern, the conduct. So many things were there that could be seen greatly discussed by Freud, and there are other people like Freud, exactly, who are contemporary to him, or they can be considered as the predecessors who had come after him and had paid a kind of a great amount of contribution in the field of psychology, where literature with psychological point of view in a strong sense can be seen, analyzed, exactly, in a strong sense. Its analysis could be noticed in this very particular period. Then we have got somebody like Karl Marx, who analyzes ideology and class and gives a rise to Marxist criticism. Right, Marxist theory, Marxist criticism got Freudian psychology or Freud psychology, where the several factors that could be seen. Exactly. So, as it was said, the major transformation in the field of criticism can be seen in this modern period very particularly, right? And thus, this modern period, became a crossroads of multiple disciplines. Linguistics was studied separately, philosophy was added in the literary criticism, psychology was added, sociology was added, exactly. This all covering upon literature, exactly. So literature which was earlier studied with those in a way delight and instruct notion, right, considering this as the major function. One of the major functions, literature must instruct and literature must delight. Now, exactly, looking at literature with linguistics point of view, philosophical point of view, psychological point of view, sociological point of view, all covering upon literature can be seen, especially in period. So this modern period remains a kind of a significant factor to be understood. म्हणून हे समजून घेणं फार महत्त्वाचं आहे. Moving ahead, we have the transition from traditional to modern criticism. Exactly, and as this age is considered an age of major transformation. Transformation आहे ती कशी आहे major level आहे, and thus this transformatory factor can be easily understood. Now we have got this very prominent figure from a Victorian period, exactly, but inclining towards a thought of modernist. He is a bridge figure, particularly, right? His essays try to talk, his work bridges the Victorian and the modern ideologies together, right? How his essay in criticism and the function of criticism at the present time are the landmarks, right? One got published in 1865 and the other got published in 1864. Exactly. He looked criticism as disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. Exactly. And yesterday also we have greatly emphasized on his this kind of a saying, exactly, where he states, what is criticism? It is a disinterested endeavor. Exactly. So when we talk about the critic, it's some he is somewhere somebody who is completely alienated, exactly, all alone otherwise, or we can say completely untouched, exactly, or we can say unbiased, right? So he is untouched, he is unbiased, so he is not governed by all of his previous thoughts, or we can say prejudices, exactly. So it is an act without, with a complete transparency, exactly. And why this transparency is, it is a transparency to learn and propagate. The critic also is learning something from the literature that he is criticizing otherwise. So to learn and to spread out, to spread away, exactly, the best that is known. So a critic must know something which is best. When he knows best, he compares that best that is known and thought in the world, exactly. And so the critic should not merely praise or blame, but should seek cultural balance and refinement, exactly. So the work of refinement, the work of, in a way, you must be able to, in a way, punish the wrong, accept the right, and glorify the truth, exactly. So this could be somewhere noticed with Arnold's philosophy of literary criticism. Arnold's philosophy is something different that tries to bridge the Victorian thought with modern transformation of ideologies and the acceptance of so many newly emerging concepts. This could be greatly stated with, this could be greatly seen with the thought process of Matthew Arnold. Exactly. His approach is still moral and humanistic. It insists on objectivity and detachment and dissipates the scientific spirit of 20th century. So what thought that he produced could be particularly seen merely discussing about so many other factors that in or the other way influence the ideas, for sure, to the Victorian people, but though they are more of moralistic and humanitarian approach, exactly, they are more of a moral and humanistic sense, exactly, you know, the foundations of 20th century scientific attitude can be seen laid by those thoughts. Somewhere their notions can be seen reflecting in the 20th century modernity. Exactly, 20th century modernity is definitely has some sort of an essence from what Arnold had thought and discussed. अर्नोल्डने जे विचार मांडले त्याचा कुठेतरी इसेन्स दिसतो, किंवा 20th सेंचुरी जो सायंटिफिक स्पिरिट शेप झालं, एक्झॅक्टली, त्यामध्ये त्याच्या मॉरल आणि ह्युमॅनिटिक अप्रोच मधनं प्रोड्यूस झालेल्या ऑब्जेक्टिव्हिटी आणि डिटॅचमेंट या थॉटला कुठेतरी ॲक्सेप्टन्स दिसतो, किंवा कुठेतरी त्याच्या आधारे पुढचे विषय जसे इन केले गेले त्याची कुठेतरी आयडेंटिटी आपल्याला दिसून येते. अँड सो this very particular important figure remains very much significant, exactly, when we are talking about the transition from traditional to modern, exactly. And so when we refer to this transition from traditional to modern, exactly, this figure Matthew Arnold remains very significant as he is a bridge figure. What he bridges, exactly, the Victorian thought, modern philosophy. So this could be seen greatly bridged by the two. Right? Now the next figure we have with us is T.S. Eliot, exactly, whose essays, traditional and individual talent, are very significant, and they are redefined in the relation between the poet and the poem. Exactly. So before we move to talk about, talk much about T.S. Eliot and his personality, otherwise, uh, let's take a break over here for a minute, exactly, and come back. एक 5 मिनिटाचा ब्रेक घेऊयात. आताच्या सेशनमध्ये आणि आपण कंटिन्यू करूयात. Hello everyone and welcome back to our lecture series on understanding the literary criticism and theories in various periods. This session we have started talking about the modern period, and we are just dealt with the two most important elements of this modern period. We just had a brief introduction to the modern period, right? And now we are going with the background to the modern period, right? We have tried to understand the works by the great Brahmin figures, right? By the way, in this lecture series, we are just going to have an overview of this entire period, and after this, we are going to check the prominent figures and the various literary genres like post-colonial literature, the postmodern literature, structuralism, deconstruction, construction, structuralism, then the psychoanalysis, the psychological literature, exactly the feminism, are the various part and the feminist critics and their contribution. Too many factors are there which we are going to cover. Exactly this major figure, and then after that we are going to talk about the contemporary literature, exactly that exists in the today's world, right? So let's move to what we have been discussing so far and continue with that. We're talking about T.S. Eliot. Prior to that, we talked about Matthew Arnold, who works as a bridge figure between modernity and the Victorian period. Right. We're talking about T.S. Eliot, who takes us towards impersonality. His essays, such as traditional and the individual talent, they define the relation between the poet and the poem. And where we find him arguing that the poet's personality should not introduce into art. Exactly, poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. Exactly. So the reference of poet's personality in case of interpreting the poetry or the art is not somewhere acceptable to T.S. Eliot, and it is something right, in the modern period get newly emerged. Further, we also find him that poets should be aware of tradition, which forms a continuous order to literature. Exactly. So, when in a way, this is somewhere a kind of a great statement that he makes here, where he makes them understand their role, exactly, in a way, responsibility, exactly, and their status too, exactly, at what kind of tradition they have been following, right? And thus it remains a significant factor here to define what Eliot's know, what Elias is, T.S. Eliot is trying to state over here, exactly. And he says that the poet should be aware of tradition, exactly, as it forms a continuous order of literature, exactly, and is a concept of objective correlative, exactly, you know objective correlative, finding the external equivalent for emotions, introduced a precise analytical vocabulary that influenced the later schools like neo-criticism, exactly. So the thoughts that were produced by T.S. Eliot and his philosophy somewhere introduced a new dimension, and that was taken into consideration and was studied or further can be seen practiced by the further critics who were influenced by the thoughts, exactly, and that became a kind of like another branch. And so Eliot and Arnold, they marked the transition from impressionistic criticism, which was based on tests, to the methodical analytical criticism somewhere, which is can be considered as one of the prominent attributes of modern criticism, right? And thus we find this factor, exactly, the factor that the transition of from traditional to the modern criticism, with the remarkable contribution by Matthew Arnold and T.S. Eliot through their philosophical ideologies or philosophical identification of thoughts based on analyzing the literature and realizing the significance of literature can be seen greatly important over here. Moving further, we have got another important part is Russian formalism, exactly, which was there in the first or the initial stage of 20th century. The first 2 or 3 decades can be seen governed by the thought of formalism, which is also called as the Russian formalism, particularly. which was on a great notion, exactly, where it talked about the forms and the the theatrical movement that was the Russian formalism, which began in Moscow at St. Petersburg with critics like Viktor Sholovsky, then Roman Jacobins, and Boris Ishinbon or Yuri Tananvo, right? Those are the prominent figures which can be seen in relation with the formalism particularly. What were the core ideas uh, uh, of this formalism particularly? Let's go and see the literariness. What makes a text literary is not its a content, but it's a form. It's a use of language. Exactly. So when it say literary, it means it becomes a part of literature or it is into a form. Those ideas put into that particular form make those ideas great otherwise. So form matters the most according to the formalist critics, right? And so they state saying that what makes a text literary is not its a content, but it's a form. In what form it is expressed, in what form it is structurized, right? And its form matters the most, and accordingly, it's a use of language. Then the next thought they have is defamiliarization. Exactly, there is Austenin. Art makes the familiar strange. It forces us to notice what we usually overlook. For example, a poetry, ordinary language is made fresh and new. Exactly. So you use, you read poetry, you come across the notions. Exactly. Those you have experienced it, right? फॉर एक्झाम्पल एखाद्या कवितेमध्ये मांडलेला विषय जेव्हा आपण ती कविता पर्पजफुली वाचतो तेव्हा आपल्याला त्याच्याकडे लक्ष जातच. अदरवाईज तो विषय आपल्यापर्यंत समाजातल्या वेगवेगळ्या घटकांमधून पोहोचला असतो, पण त्याचं स्पेशल पोहोचण्याचं काम कुठं करतं तर आर्ट करतं. म्हणजे काय, ऑर्डिनरी लँग्वेज इज मेड फ्रेश अँड न्यू अँड सो इट मेक्स familiar strange. It forces us to notice what we usually overlook. Focus on structure. Exactly. They studied the narrative techniques, sound patterns, and syntax. Exactly. Not author nor psychology. Exactly. And thus the formalism that gives much of importance to its a form, exactly, and the significance of form that could be seen greatly conceived in modern period. फॉर्म बद्दल बोलणं, त्याच्या कन्स्ट्रक्शन बद्दल बोलणं, त्याच्या स्ट्रक्चर बद्दल बोलणं, त्याच्या स्ट्रक्चरला इम्पॉर्टंट, अशा प्रकारच्या गोष्टी जास्त इम्पॉर्टंट दिसतो. आणि त्यामुळे defamiliarization, focus on structure could be seen. Exactly. And what was the significance of this? The formalists separated literature from biography, history, or morality. Exactly. Their point of view of looking at literature was totally different from those who looked at the literature in a different angle. Their approach laid the foundation for structuralism and a new criticism. Exactly, as this Russian formalism was at its peak, we can see various ideas from this Russian formalism can be picked up by the further figures, literary critics who were there, exactly, in case of propagation of structuralist ideas and new criticism. Now, to summarize, we can say the Russian formalism has made literary study scientific and systematic by emphasizing form over content. Exactly, and it can be stated where earlier in the earlier period, content getting much of importance, right? But now these Russian formalist or this Russian formalism can be somewhere seen giving much of importance to the form rather than that of the content. Exactly, and as I stated previously, it is somewhere laying foundation for the structuralist approach and the new criticism ideology. Right. Moving further, we have the new criticism. Now, the English speaking world, especially in the America and British movement known as New Criticism, carried forward kind of similar ideas. Exactly. And the prominent figures in this period were I.A. Richards, T.S. Eliot, Kenneth Brooks, and W.K. Wimsatt and M.C. Beardsley. Exactly. Now, they talked about the intentional fallacy, the affective fallacy, where I.A. Richards talked about practical criticism. Then T.S. Eliot can be seen talking about functional criticism through the essay Exactly. What were the principal thoughts that got greatly flourished in the period of neo-criticism that lasted from 1920s to 1950s? When we talk about Russian structuralism, Russian formalism, we can see it is there in 1920 to 1930 and 40 only, which lasts for a decade or two otherwise. But here we can see the neo-criticism taking a kind of a great amount of span in case of understanding the vast modern period, right? Let us go and try to understand the main principles of this period. Textual autonomy. The text is an independent object, meaning lies within its structure over the thought. That is textual autonomy, right? Right. It means the text is an independent object, right? We are talking about the main principles of neo-criticism. Neo-criticism में कुठले कुठले झाले text एक individual identity आहे. Exactly, it is an individual object. त्याला जे meaning येतं ते form मुळे येतं. Meaning lies within its structure, right? Now close reading was again an important factor that got developed. The careful analysis of paradox, irony, tension, and ambiguity within the text got greater amount of interest in close reading technique. Exactly. So to interpret what has been there, exactly, to find out, scanning is different and close reading is different. Exactly. And this close reading technique, exactly, where you are there to find out the irony, paradox, the tension, and the ambiguity, particularly unity and organic form also got greater amount of importance, and it remain a key principle. Exactly, a good poem achieves unity through internal coherence, not external references. Exactly, how it is logically connected, how it has been structured, that matters the sense. Then definitely again it taking us towards the structuralist thought. Exactly, and so the thought that a good poem, exactly, achieves unity, the unity and the organic form. Exactly, so to get then to that organic form of poetry, a poem remains a poem when it is united in an internal way. The logical coherence and structure of this poetry कशी त्या पोएमची बांधणी केली गेली ना, त्यावरून त्या कवितेच्या यशाचं किंवा त्याच्या ऑर्गॅनिक युनिटेशन मध्ये दिसतं, राईट. अँड द रिजेक्शन ऑफ ऑथोरियल सॉरी and the rejection of authorial intention and reader response. What the author intended or how readers feel is irrelevant to meaning. Exactly. So authorचं लिहिताना काहीतरी वेगळं इंटेन्शन असू शकतं आणि रीडर्स रीड करताना वेगळं. एक्झॅक्टली. सो perceptions, exactly, perceptions that vary person to person was kind of a significant factor. Exactly. So this could be seen somewhere getting conceived in its all way form, particularly. For example, when you try to understand John Donne's The Canonization, a new critic would analyze paradoxes and metaphors to show how love becomes a spiritual act, focusing individually or solely or only on the textual pattern, not on Donne's life. Exactly. So when we say the rejection of authorial intention and reader response, exactly, so in case of analyzing now, in a what sense you are analyzing this John Donne's poetry with neo criticism point of view. काय सांगतो? Exactly, the canonization, a new critic would analyze paradoxes and a metaphor, exactly, to show how love becomes a spiritual act, exactly, where he only focuses on the textual pattern. It means again the structure, exactly, the structure remains important, exactly, and the form, right? And so moving forward, we have legacy. New criticism dominated mid 20th century English departments, defining the discipline English studies as we know it. Criticism. Now talking about psychoanalytic criticism, again this another form of literary criticism plays a vital role in case of understanding the psychological notions of the characters and the various factors that literally exist in society. एक्झॅक्टली जे समाजाच्या मनाचा भाग आहे त्याला कुठेतरी लिटरेचर मधून आवाज देण्याचा, लिटरेचर मधून मांडण्याचा किंवा व्यक्त होण्याचा कसा अँगल होऊ शकतो याच्याबद्दल स्वतंत्र अभ्यास करणारी एक क्रिटिकल ब्रांच म्हणजे कुठलं तर सायकोअनालिटिक क्रिटिसिझम आहे. एक्झॅक्टली. आणि याचा सुद्धा खूप मोठा पगडा मॉडर्न क्रिटिसिझमच्या धर्तीवरती दिसतो. Exactly. Now we have got a formalist who focused on language. Psychoanalytic critics explored the human psyche beneath the literature. Exactly. The human psyche. It means mind. Exactly. So characters and their minds are in a way studied. And so we have got a very famous psychologist, Sigmund Freud, the interpretation of dreams, that he introduced the idea that unconscious desires shape human behavior. Unconscious desires shape human behavior. Exactly. So your thoughts, let's labelize them conscious, unconscious afterwards, but the way they influence your behavior, exactly, and your conduct otherwise could be seen. And so, literature, like a dream, expresses the repressed wishes symbolically of the thought that he propagated. Exactly. So the analysis of literature can be purely seen with this various versatile form that was never been touched by the previous critics, either in Victorian period or in a way in other previous periods, which is greatly, so it's, major transformation जे म्हणतो ना आपण मॉडर्न पिरियड मध्ये क्रिटिसिझमनी मेजर ट्रान्सफॉर्मेशन बघितलं. अनेक डायमेन्शन्सनी लिटरेचरकडे बघण्याची जी थेअरी डेव्हलप झाली ना, दॅट मॅटर्स द मोस्ट. आणि ती इथं आपण इन अ वे बघू शकतो. राईट. मग सिग्मंड फ्रॉइड काय सांगतोय? सिग्मंड फ्रॉइडचं अनालिसिस वेगळं. राईट. पुढे जाऊन बघायचं ना काय काय अजून एक्सप्लेन केलंय. एक्झॅक्टली वी फाइंड हिम explaining exactly id, ego, and superego, right? The three parts of psyche. Exactly. Then he talked about the Oedipus complex and Oedipus complex, the child's unconscious desire for the parent of the opposite sex. Exactly. So this theory is greatly discussed, psychoanalysis theory. Exactly. Somewhere the opposite gender attraction somehow suppressed. It's kind of a great, खूप डिटेल्ड स्टडी आहे बरं का याच्याबद्दल. एक्झॅक्टली इतक्या शॉर्ट स्पॅन मध्ये किंवा इतक्या छोट्या पिरियड सांगणार नाही, पण एक्झाम पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यूने याचं अनालिसिस फार महत्त्वाचं आहे. एक्झॅक्टली याचं हॅमलेटचं अनालिसिस किंवा अजून बाकीच्या गोष्टींचं अनालिसिस, सायकोलॉजिकल नोशन मॅटर्स द मोस्ट. एक्झॅक्टली. अँड सो द चाइल्ड्स अनकॉन्शियस डिझायर फॉर द पॅरेंट ऑफ ऑपोजिट सेक्स इज देअर. Then symbolism and repression. Art transforms forbidden desires into acceptable forms. Exactly. And his application criticism, authors express their hidden neuroses through their characters. Exactly. So this is again an important factor. Exactly. म्हणजे काय, जे माझ्या मनात असतं, जे मला व्यक्त होतात नाही किंवा जसं वागणं मला जमत नाही. एक्झॅक्टली. समवेअर माय डिझायर बाय द ऑथर, एक्झॅक्टली his desires, his various longings can be seen, in an attachment otherwise with the character. So we can see, in a way clearly stating here that authors express their hidden neuroses through their characters, and readers too may find their own unconscious reflected in the text. Exactly. And so we find them some or the other way assimilating with what it is particularly. अर्थ काय आहे त्याच्याशी कुठेतरी assimilate करताना ते दिसतं. And thus it is of a greater importance otherwise to understand. याचे काय सांगितलं ना ते म्हणून तितक्या महत्त्वाचं आहे बघा. So for example, Hamlet, according to Freud, exactly, the prince's hesitation as an expression of the Oedipus complex. Hamlet cannot kill Claudius because he has unconsciously identified with him. Exactly. He relates with him. Exactly. Hamlet's the relation. Extreme amount of you must refer to that at your individual level. The way he explains the Hamlet's, his psychoanalysis theory, his psychological notions, and understanding the characterizations. Especially, he has applied them for the Shakespearean studies. And exactly, Shakespearean characters can be seen Freud, can be seen explained quite well by Freud. Exactly in his interpretation of text, right? So we have got another prominent figure, exactly, who contribute in case of the psychoanalytic criticism. Right, Sigmund Freud is there. We've got Carl Jung and archetypal criticism. Right, Jung introduced the concept of collective unconsciousness, a storehouse of universal symbols and archetypes. the hero, the mother, the shadow, exactly. And so we have got critics like Northrop Fryer, and who later used this idea in Anatomy of Criticism to identify the recurring myth patterns in literature, particularly. Exactly, and this is also again a very famous thought process that was put forth in psychoanalytical criticism by Carl Jung. Exactly, and is archetypal criticism. They structurized the patterns of labelizing the labelizing psychological notions of the literature particularly, and so the symbols and archetypes particularly, the hero, how it gets portrayed, the mother and the shadow, all other things were there. Exactly. आपण हे खरं तर इन डिटेल पुढच्या आपल्या या सगळ्या सेशन्समध्ये जेव्हा आपण मॉडर्न लिटरेचर आणि त्याच्यातले पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यू बघणार आहोत ना, तेव्हा आपण इन डिटेल बघणार आहोत, त्यामुळे ते समजून घेणार आहोत. Then we have got Jacques Lacan, exactly, who is a post-Freudian. Exactly, he reformulated the Freud thought of linguistics. The unconscious is structured like a language, meaning human identity is shaped by language and desire, a view that links psychoanalysis to the later structuralism and post-structuralism. Exactly, that's the study that dwells into the function of language, formulation of language, the formulation of language, and it's a key role in case of delivering the content and its meaning and the semantic approaches. Exactly, that is somehow angled towards some or the other way linguistic studies, particularly the structuralism and post-structuralism, where the psychoanalysis theory is greatly associated. So Jacques Lacan is somewhere of this thought, who is a post-Freudian literary critics. Then we have got the seventh prominent figure of literary criticism is the structuralism, which origins now the structuralism arises from the linguistic theories of Ferdinand de Saussure, who distinguished between language and parole, exactly the system of language and the individual utterances, right? Meaning, for Saussure is relational and not interesting. A word means what it does because of its differences from the other words. Exactly. It is a pain because it is not a screen, and so it is screen because it is not a pain, and so it has their individual differences, and so their words different meaning. Exactly, we form a meaning particularly because it is a no. It's kind of like a different study otherwise to understand the signs, their meaning. Exactly, and the study of semiotics very particularly that plays a kind of a great role again. Exactly, the structures and their meanings, and how structurizations in a way regulate the meaning and interpretation of words and text particularly could be seen as a kind of though it is a bit different from the other thought process that we have come across, but particularly this again another dimension. Now when you talk about Victorian period, when you talk about neoclassical period, you do not find those sort of notions greatly conceived, right? So that's the specialty of modern period. Exactly, versatility is definitely there, but those many dimensions of looking at the literature are the most specific characteristics of modern period otherwise, right? And so coming back to what structuralism says, in literary criticism, how it refers, a structuralist applied this idea to literature that a literary text is a system of signs governed by rules and structures like language itself. Exactly. Now it means those are the various signs, exactly, and they have their meanings, exactly, and so the correlational of decoding these meanings is already existing in our brain, or it's an indirect or direct exercise may allow us to find out the meaning. Okay, and thus the structure is called as language. So meaning is produced through relationships and not intentions. Exactly, you relate, your first meaning relates with the other, and accordingly you form a complete meaning, right? So we have got David Strauss with us, who applied structural analysis to myths, discovered binary oppositions like life and death, nature and culture. Then we have got Roland Barthes, okay, in his mythologies, and the death of author, again an interesting part of explanation from him, by the way, Roland Barthes, right? That meaning lies not in the author but the system of language and culture, which plays an again kind of like a vital role. Then we have got the Tejevetan Todro, and then Gerard Janetti, then Roman Jacobson, who developed narrative theory and semiotics. Again, so people here, semiotics play a kind of a great role, in case of decoding. So structuralist construction, deconstruction. So their understanding matters the most. And what is the core idea of this thought? That literature is not a reflection of reality, but construction. Exactly, a structured system of meanings. And for example, in studying fairy tales, structuralists like Lazamer Prop identified recurring narrative functions. And so hero departs, the test, the helpers, and rewards. Exactly. And so a scientific grammar of storytelling can be seen. Exactly. So it much and more goes on structuring, formalization, taking shape, becoming a structure of certain, and it's a collaboration, creating meaning. It's a collective identity. So many parts are there that we can see greatly discussed in this period otherwise, right? And the moving forward, we have Marxist criticism, which again, the proponent of this can be seen Karl Marx, which is based on the theory of economic base, which determines cultural superstructure, which laid a groundwork for Marxist criticism. Now, talking about the key concept, literature both reflects and reinforces the ideology of its time, and so the critic's task is to expose the ideological forces shaping text. And some important thinkers under Marxist ideology can be seen: George Lucas, exactly, then Antonio Gramsci, then Louis Althusser, and Raymond R.W., Raymond Williams, and Terry Eagleton. Right now, what George Lucas did, he focused that literature reflects social and historical reality. Realism is the highest form. Exactly. So propagating the realistic ideologies that literature mainly does was kind of a thought process. We find him coming out here. Right? Then we've got another is Antonio Gramsci, who says that idea of cultural hegemony, the domination through consent and not by force. So cultural hegemony is again another important part that he has discussed particularly, right? That is of much more importance to give or to this particular ideology also. Then we have got Louis Althusser, who saw ideology as a structure that shapes individuals' consciousness. And then we have got Raymond Williams and Terry Eagleton, who states that they studied literature as a part of cultural production within capitalism, right? And so the example of Marxist ideology is that when we have a Marxist studying Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, he might explore how marriage reflects class mobility and property relations rather than simply romance. Exactly, and so this significant factor is definitely there, which in or other way highlights that, and its impact. The Marxist literature relates with politics, power, and ideology, which paves the way for cultural studies and later postmodern theory. And so this all comes under modern period of literature. Exactly. And then looking at the broad shift of modern criticism, particularly, exactly, the traditional one, which is quite moral and expressive, whereas modern criticism is quite analytical and theoretical. The traditional criticism focuses on author, it focuses on text and the or the language. The traditional criticism is more of impressionistic, whereas the modern criticism is more of systematic and scientific. In traditional criticism, the emphasis is on meaning, it is emphasis on structure and the process. Uh, Here in traditional criticism, the literature is expression, and here literature is construction. So, in a way, we can see modern criticism turning literature into a field of intellectual inquiry influenced by linguistics, psychology, and sociology in a way, otherwise, right? It is of a much more importance to have overlook of those things. And to conclude, in a way, to talk about modern of literary criticism, particularly, which revolutionize how we read and understand the literature in a particular way. So, from Arnold's modern idealism to Eliot's impersonality, and from formalism's scientific study of form to Freud's exploration of the unconscious, and from Saussure's structural linguistics to Marxist ideology, all of those and all the each, in a way, each of the movement give criticism a new foundation in modern period of literary criticism particularly. And so this modern criticism can be seen changing the central question from what does the author mean to how does the meaning happen, right? What does the author mean from how does the meaning happen? And so the passive role of authors, or in a way much of importance to the work can be seen, the literary work. And so it establishes the groundwork for postmodern theories that would follow: deconstruction, definitely, then feminism, post-colonialism, and reader response criticism are the upcoming views of this modern particular period, right? And so it plays in a way a kind of a vital role in case of understanding and the shaping of literature otherwise, right? And so it is of a much more importance to understand that. So guys, this was all about the overview of modern period particularly, right? So we have seen the various other forms of criticism that got developed in modern period particularly, right? And so it is of a much more importance to understand, right? While highlighting today about modern period, it is a kind of a vast period, right? We just today had a kind of like um, some brief intro of, or just we just have overlooked on we just had a look at the various factors that remain very significant in case of understanding the criticism that was shaped in the modern period. Exactly, it is a span of just 6 to 7 decades particularly, but it laid it laid its impact lasting in the contemporary literature also. Exactly, and thus it is considered as the phase of major transformation in critical identities and critical ideas. Exactly, many great critics. Also, we have seen what it in a way made, shaping its literature or the literary criticism, and its a base particularly, right? So that's all for our today's session. Let's meet in our upcoming session discussing in detail about the various modern sub branches that got developed in criticism particularly, right?